Hi guys, welcome to my channel Amie Howard Art. I'm Amie, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how you can draw an owl eye study like the one which I have drawn here. So let's get straight into this tutorial. So for this tutorial I started off in exactly the same way as all of my other drawings and tutorials, and that is just by making sure that I've got a really accurate outline, especially of the most important features which I want to include within the portrait. So for me this was the eyes, getting the eyes really spherical and getting the highlights and all of the dark areas around the eyes in exactly the right place. So once I had that outline in place, then it was time to get down to the colour, and to begin with all I did was use a colour eraser and just got rid of the graphite lines around the eyes. So I erased the pupil and the area around the iris as well, so the coloured part of the eye. Once I'd erased that, then I went through with a dark sepia pencil, made sure that it was really nice and sharp, and for that I used a Derwent Superpoint mini sharpener, and I just used the sharp point of the pencil using a really light pressure and just went around where I had previously erased that graphite. So I went around the iris and aligned the pupil and added in all of the dark shapes around the eye. Once I had those in place, then it was time to go through and just really lightly shade some of those dark areas. So on the left hand eye there was a really dark area directly above the eye, so I made sure that I just really gently mapped that in with some really soft pencil strokes and used a shading motion just really gently back and forth with light pressure on that dark sepia pencil just to really map in that dark area. Once I had those outer areas mapped in, then I went through and mapped in that pupil. So this was one of the largest dark areas on the drawing itself, and on the reference photo the pupil was really precise, so I had to make sure that I got that completely accurate within my drawing. So to do that I just made sure that I maintained that sharp point on that pencil just by resharpening, and then I used the light pressure once again just to add in the very outer edge of the pupil, and then really lightly started to shade in that. And within the pupil there were little tiny bits of highlights, and instead of going over that with the dark sepia I just completely avoided those areas to begin with. So once I'd got the shape and made sure that it was really nice and precise and round, then I just shaded through it, and then it was time to start to add some of the colour to the iris. So to start the iris colour I really gently laid down a layer of some warm grey 1, and again I made sure that I had a nice sharp pencil and just really gently laid the colour down. Now the eyes of an owl are really glassy looking, they are incredibly smooth, so it's really important to convey that with your drawing. So to make sure that I achieved that I just used really tiny circles with my pencil, and I just made sure that I continually went around the entire area just really overlapping these circles to get a really nice colour lay down. Once I had that nice base layer down, then I started to add the yellow, orange and red colours, and I actually used a few different yellow and red colours for this. So I started off with a dark cadmium yellow, and again I made sure I had that really sharp pencil, and I made exactly the same motion with this layer as I did with the base layer. So I made those really tiny circles, really making sure that I was overlapping them to really fill the tooth of the paper and to get a really nice smooth even colour. So I mainly laid the yellow colour to the bottom half of the eye because that was where a lot of the light was actually entering the eye, and that was the lightest part. So I made sure that I concentrated a lot of the yellow pencil to that part. Then I decided to go through with my lighter orange tone, so for this I used a cadmium orange from the Polychromos. And I used exactly the same technique to lay this colour down, so I made sure I had a really sharp pencil, and I used those really small circular motions to make sure that I covered as much of the tooth of the paper as possible. And I added this colour mainly to the more darker areas, so I started to add this to some of the shadows around the very edge of the iris, and I started to introduce this colour to the top of the iris as well, so where you've got that really dark shadow. I slowly built up the red colours, working from a light cadmium red to a scarlet red, and then finally a middle cadmium red, and those red colours I mainly focused onto the top of the eye because that is where I had a lot of shadow according to the reference photo. So I made sure that I added a lot of those red colours there, especially more of the middle cadmium red, the darkest red, And again, I also made sure that I added a few of those red colours to the shadowed areas around the outside of the iris. And to blend all of those colours together, I just used my Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil, and I really gently burnished using a circular motion with that pencil again, just to really lightly blend everything together and to create a really nice transition from those light colours to those darker colours. For some of the shadows in the red areas, especially on that upper part of the eye, I actually went through and layered down a little bit of a green, and I used the permanent green olive from the Polychromos. Now when you layer red and green together, you can create some really interesting shadow colours rather than just going through and using a darker toned red or even a dark sepia or a black pencil to add your shadows. If you introduce a little bit of green to red, you create a really interesting shadow. So I made sure that I added a lot of the green colour to the upper part of the eye above the pupil, and then I also used that green colour and brought it into the lighter area as well, because on my reference photo I had a little bit of a shadow going around that pupil. So I made sure that I used that green colour to just introduce a little bit of a shadow and a little bit of extra dimension through there. And again, I made sure that I used my pencil in exactly the same way, making sure it's really nice and sharp and just using circular motions to try and get as much coverage down on the paper as possible. For the actual pupil and colouring that, I just layered loads of layers of some dark sepia. I added some Delft blue in there as well, and I also added some burnt umber. Mixing blue and brown together creates a really interesting dark tone, and it adds to the depth of the piece. So I just mixed those colours together, overlaid with a little bit more of some dark sepia, and also introduced a little bit of black to there. And I introduced that black colour because the pupils were really dark and really rich, and it just needed that little bit of an extra push to the dark side with that black pencil. For the highlights on this eye, it was mainly a combination of some Delft blue and some really light grey brown tones. So I used Delft blue where you had the highlight overlapping the pupil, and then where the highlight overlapped that orangey red tone of the iris, I just went through with some raw umber 10%, some warm grey 1, and I also used some French grey 30%, and also just really lightly layered some dark sepia, just really gently shading, make sure I got that really nice sharp pencil to get some really light layers down. And then just blended out with the Caran d'Ache Luminance white to make sure that everything was really nice and smooth to achieve that really glassy look that owl eyes have. After I'd added all of those areas within the eye, got that colour down and the really nice dark area of the pupil, I found that I had to go around the eye and darken up a few of those dark areas. So I just went around with some dark sepia and also a little bit of that black pencil, layered a little bit of Delft blue and burnt umber together just to increase the dark tones surrounding the eye, so it really made the eye pop and stand out. Now when you look at an owl and really study the feathers, they can look a little bit daunting and look incredibly difficult to render, and they're really not that difficult. So I used my warm grey 1 and the cold grey 1 as a base layer. I added the warm grey 1 to the warmer toned areas and the cold grey 1 to the cooler toned areas, just making sure that I had a really sharp pencil and really gently layering back and forth. And I really studied the reference photo to kind of really look at the direction that the feathers were going in, and then made sure that I used my pencil in the correct direction. Once I'd established those warm and cool areas, then I started to layer some mid-tones. So I went through with some raw umber 10% from the Caran d'Ache Luminance, some French grey 30% from the Luminance as well, and I also used some burnt umber to add a little bit of a brown tone to places, and I layered that with some dark cadmium yellow as well to create a really nice warm brown tone. In the cooler toned areas, I gently layered some grey blue from the Luminance, really gently layered that on top of the base layer, and then I burnished and blended that out with the white pencil to create a really soft blue-grey tone through there. And then once I had those mid-tones down, then I started to go through with the feather texture. So if you look really closely at a reference photo of an owl or a bird, you'll notice really small individual lines, and you'll notice that they crisscross over one another. So once I had those base tones established and all of the light tones and all of that, then I started to go over with those darker colours, and this is where I started to add that texture. So to add that texture, I made sure I had a really sharp pencil on my dark sepia, and all I did was just initially laid down some shading to establish a nice darker base, and then I went over with the point of the pencil and I just really gently crisscrossed a lot of my strokes. So I looked at the reference photo feather by feather and I started to apply my strokes in that manner, feather by feather, and I sort of mimicked the letter V because that's what it kind of looks like when you've got the vein of the feather running through the middle, and then you've got these lines coming off diagonally either side of that vein through the middle, and it looks like the letter V. So I mimicked that shape throughout each feather, and I made sure that the feathers were really overlapping and intersecting, so the ends of each of the little V segments were overlapping each other to form an X. And that's the way that I added the texture to this. I just started off really lightly to begin with, just to make sure that the way in which I was adding that texture was correct and it conveyed the right texture of the feathers. And then once I was happy with a little section of it, then I went over with a few more layers and a little bit of a harder pressure and really picked out some of the darker toned areas within each feather. And all I did was just mimic that pattern over the entire section. So I went around the entire left eye, just adding in those base layers, working my way up to the midtones, and then going in with that final dark sepia, adding a little bit of shading to really develop the darker tones, and then going over and adding all of that texture over. Coming across the middle, I just applied exactly the same technique, except through here areas were a lot lighter than on the left hand side. So to keep those areas lighter, I just made sure that I used less of those darker toned pencils. So I started off with a base layer of some warm grey 1 and cold grey 1, built up with some raw umber 10%, a little bit of that grey blue as well to develop those cooler toned areas, and then went in with the dark sepia. So instead of developing some more browner tones and going through with a light shading of some dark sepia, I just went straight in and started to add all of that texture down with a really sharp dark sepia pencil. Again, I made sure that I applied the same texture and identified the length and the shape of each feather, and then applied the V texture and the overlapping in the way that was shown on the reference photo. I also made sure that I paid attention to my piece as a whole. So even though I was working with a reference photo, I wasn't referencing it exactly. So I wasn't making sure that I went through and added each individual line exactly as it showed on the reference photo. I made sure that I looked at my piece as a whole and made sure that it was working, and then added the texture and the tones in a way that was working with my piece. As we come to the beak, this was a completely different texture to the feathers, and it was really nice and smooth. So in order to maintain that nice smooth texture, I used the same technique as I applied through the eyes. So I started off with my base layers, making sure that those really light base tone colours were sharp, and using small circular motions to really try and fill as much of the tooth of the paper as possible to really maintain this really shiny beak surface. And I just really slowly built up to those darker tones, so really slowly building up to that dark sepia. And through this beak I added a lot of blue tones, so I went through with some dark indigo, some delft blue and some grey blue. I also went through and burnished and blended with that Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil a fair amount through here again to try and maintain that really nice shiny beak smooth finish. You'll notice with birds that you often get some overlap of some really fine wispy feathers over the beak and certain areas, and the technique which I used to convey that was I actually went through and used my Tombow eraser to pick out some of those really lighter feathers overlapping the beak. So I used my rectangular Tombow for this. I just made sure I went through with a really light pressure and really gently moved the eraser in the direction that the feather was going, and the pencil lifted really easily. And it lifted easily because I'd gone through and used that really light pressure, so I was able to lift the colour a considerable amount and achieve these really fine details that I wanted on the beak. If you want to learn more about how to erase your coloured pencil, if you are struggling with it, then I do have a video on that which I will link in the description and as a card up above for you. So carrying on across the rest of the piece, I applied the feathers to the top and the middle of the eyes in exactly the same way as the left hand side. Again, because the right hand side was a little bit lighter than the left hand side, I just made sure that I applied fewer of those darker colours. So I just added the base layers and really slowly built up, really lightly layering, making sure my pencils were sharp until it come to the stage where I could add some texture and some of those fine details when I switched to using a dark sepia pencil, again making sure it's really nice and sharp to get those really fine details in. And then it came to do the right hand eye, and I just applied exactly the same process as I did for the left hand eye. So I went around the entire iris and the pupil with a dark sepia pencil, just made sure they were really nice and spherical, really nice and precise, and then went through and fleshed out a few of those darker areas, fleshed out that pupil as well, adding in some blue and brown tones to increase the depth through there, and eventually working my way up to the black to really add that really intense black tone down there. Then I went through and added a base layer on the iris of some warm grey 1, added in my yellow, and then really slowly built up to those red tones, working through my cadmium orange, light cadmium red, scarlet red, and then middle cadmium red as well. For those shadows, again, I applied some of that green, that permanent green olive, and it created this really nice shadow tone, and a really nice depth of colour, which I don't think I would have been able to achieve if I'd just gone in with a darker red or just applied a dark sepia over. I then made sure that I translated some of that green through the rest of the eye around a little bit of the shadow towards the right hand side of there, and then just blended out with that white pencil to achieve a really nice smooth glassy look. To finish off this owl, I just completed the feathers around that right hand side of the eye, and there were some really fine wispy black feathers overlapping the left hand side of that right eye, and I just used a really sharp dark sepia pencil using really light pressure and just really gently added those in, and it creates a real sense of dimension. Just adding all of these overlapping areas, it just creates a really nice sense of realism. Finally, I went through and added a few more details with that dark sepia to some of the feather areas, and I made sure that everything was really nice and blended and everything worked together. And that's pretty much it for this piece. I was really pleased with how this actually turned out. The effect of the really shiny, really smooth eyes contrasting against those feathers I think works really well, and the really piercing stare of the owl is really transfixing and it really comes to life. So that's pretty much it for today's tutorial. This was a really fun and challenging one for me to draw. It was a really different technique which I've used to drawing fur, and I hope that me explaining some of my tips and techniques has helped you guys if you are drawing feathers or drawing something similar. And if you want to draw along with this tutorial, then I will link the reference photo for you to go and use. But if you want to follow along with me in real time with full voiceover, then there is the full 3-part series available on my Patreon and also to my website subscribers, and I will leave a link in the description for both of those if you want to go and check them out and draw along with me. There's a whole load of other tutorials available on my Patreon and to my website subscribers as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, make sure you give it a big thumbs up, and if you're new around here and you want to see more tutorials and live streams and art advice, then make sure that you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon to be notified of all of my future videos. There are some just over there which I think you're going to love, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!